Hi, Elaine here from Marker Geek. I've got a colouring video for you today featuring an older Stamping Bella stamp, one that is actually currently the Stamping Bella Stamp of the Month offer for March 2019. So the link for that will be in the description below, along with all the other relevant links like my blog post, etc. I haven't done a video with a voiceover for a while, so do bear with me as I'm kind of out of practice. I simply haven't really had the time or the inclination to do videos with voiceovers, unfortunately. Sometimes life just gets in the way a little bit, and it is much easier to edit colouring videos without doing a voiceover. Also, a lot of the time I don't really have that much to say, but I thought I would do a commentary for this one, just to talk about a few things, because I know a lot of you do enjoy the voiceovers and picking up some extra info. As I said, this is for one of the older Stamping Bella stamps, which I suddenly realised I hadn't actually done a colouring video for until now, so I thought I would colour it again and share the process with you. I find that a question that I often see and a question that I'm often asked is where to start with an image, particularly for people who maybe haven't been colouring for very long, just getting into it. Sometimes images with lots of details can be a little bit daunting. I would say just jump in. That is the most common piece of advice I would give. On an image like this one, however, where it's cherry chick, so what we've got is a bowl of cherries with a chick on top, because why not? But obviously we're going to be using reds with this particular image, and reds being quite strongly pigmented, it's often advisable to colour the other areas of the image first, colour the lighter areas that are going to be next to those reds before tackling the reds, so that you can avoid the problem of having the lighter markers maybe drag those reds over into areas where you don't want them. This would be particularly advisable when you're doing something like a sky background and maybe you've got red flowers or something in the foreground. If you colour those first and then you try to colour the light blue sky maybe afterwards, you do run the risk of really quite probably dragging quite a lot of that red and getting some red streaks in your sky, which is obviously not something that you want. And yeah, so on this image, knowing that there would be quite a lot of red and I was going for some quite strong reds on those cherries, I started with the bowl first because I knew I wanted that to be white, so I would be using light shades of cool grey. So I started with that, and then I moved on to the chick, again because also I would be using quite a few layers, I knew, with the chick, because working with yellows I often tend to find that I need to layer quite a lot. I don't, a lot of people will say that working with reds is quite hard. I actually don't find working with reds to be particularly difficult when working with Copic markers. Working with yellows, on the other hand, is not my absolute favourite. I often find myself wishing for some additional sort of tones in the yellows in Copics. So yeah, I often find that I need to layer a fair amount to get a result that I'm happy with. And knowing that, laying down quite a lot of ink on the paper next to an area where I've coloured with quite a strong colour like red, I'm then running the risk of making a bit of a mess. So I got all of the colouring out of the way of the chick and the bowl before moving on to those reds. As with anything in colouring, this isn't a hard and fast rule that I always follow. It very much depends on the image and probably, to be honest, how I'm feeling at that particular time. If I've got an image where there is an area that is quite tricky, I might start with that area, even if I'm colouring using reds. Just really depends on how I think it's going to go. Another question that comes up fairly often is about which order to use your markers in. As you will see on this particular image, I am colouring from dark to light, with the exception of this first cherry, which I started to colour before I decided to add in a slightly darker earth tone for the shadow areas. But for the most part, I'm colouring using my very darkest to map out those darker areas and then blending out back towards the lightest shade. I don't always work this way. I have been doing this more often than not recently, as you might see from some of my other colouring videos. Quite often I used to colour by using the lightest marker to map out my shadow areas, the areas where I wanted deeper shading, and then going in with my darkest marker over that and blending out back towards the light. If you're nervous about committing pen to paper, that's quite a good approach, especially when doing things like pleats and folds in dresses and clothing. You can kind of map out and get a sense for where you want to put those darker areas without making the complete commitment, because it's easier to cover up those lighter shades and correct any little mistakes that you might have made. A lot of people will say that, yeah, you use less ink if you just start with the darkest marker. Maybe. It depends. It depends on how you colour. It depends on the paper you use. It depends on the particular colours you've chosen and how easily they blend. Again, there is no hard and fast rule. Try various ways of laying the ink down on the paper and see what works for you. At the end of the day, we're laying ink down on paper to colour an image. There isn't one rule that will magically work for everyone. There isn't one technique that is automatically going to make your colouring amazing. It's a case of practice and experimentation and seeing what works for you. Paper, as I've just mentioned, makes a massive difference. You can adapt to colour with most papers. There are some people that have done some fantastic work with Copic markers on just regular printer paper. I've tried it myself, and actually one of my favourite pieces of colouring I actually did on printer paper. But it requires a different approach to just colouring on my usual Make It Colour blending card. I can't layer quite as much if I colour on printer paper without things bleeding, because the paper is softer, and as the Copic ink blends within the fibres of the paper, it will spread. And actually, this is what I tend to find with Nina Solar White, which a lot of people use and recommend and get great results on. I, however, do not love it, probably because I tend to layer quite a lot of ink, and it simply just, it won't take as much layering as I like to do. Make It Colour blending card will. Another alternative would be, which is more available to people in the US, would be Express It blending card. And I think Gina K's cardstock. But personally, I don't get on well with Nina because it is a softer paper, and so the ink tends to travel more in the fibres of the paper, and you get that sort of feathering over your stamped lines. And I just find that I can't quite get the results that I would like. That is, again, a matter of personal preference. And when it comes to paper, I would suggest that you just get as many papers as possible and try them all out. Try papers that are easily available to you in your country, in your area, and see what works for you. What works for one person may not be ideal for another person. So again, as with all things, it's a case of experimenting for yourself and trying. I do sell the Make It Colour blending card in packs on my website. However, I am based in the UK. And so if you are outside of Europe, particularly in the US and other similar locations, it is quite prohibitive cost-wise to send packs of paper because of the weight. So while I am happy to send anywhere, I would rather see you spend your money on more colouring supplies and stamps rather than paying the shipping when there are options that you should be able to get hold of fairly readily in your own area. So do a little bit of research. I'm very happy with the paper that I've got, so I haven't tended to be trying more papers in recent years. I have in the past tried Express It blending card, which I found to be fairly similar, not completely the same as the Make It Colour, but fairly similar. And I certainly found that I preferred it more than the Nina Solar White. It behaves fairly similarly to the Make It Colour blending card, and it allows for more layering. So yeah, I would recommend getting hold of papers that are readily available in your area and trying those out before trying to ship in from overseas where you're paying shipping costs. And quickly, just back to the colouring that I'm doing on screen at the moment. As you can see, I've tackled each of the cherries pretty much individually, apart from a couple of areas. This helps because it means that you're tackling each as a separate object. And while batch colouring can be quite efficient, you also maybe would tend to colour things a little bit more uniformly. And really what you want in something like this, where it's a natural object, like the cherries, is to have some sort of natural sort of variation. So while I'm taking a similar approach to each one, I'm colouring each one as its own individual object. And I think that tends to give a more natural feel in the end. On some things, I will batch colour and I'll add the darker colour to all of them or a few of them at a time. It depends on what the focus of the image is. So if it's in little detail areas like leaves where they're not the main focus and they're just a little extra detail, I might kind of batch colour those, by which I mean laying down the darkest colour on each of them and then doing the next colour on each of them and then the next, rather than colouring each one individually. It is a little bit quicker to do, but for things like the cherries, especially using colours where you are concerned about getting a decent blend, colours that maybe are stronger and you maybe want to be careful about how you're working with those, it is better to focus on one at a time. And in the end, I think it's worth the time investment for the effect that you get. And on something like this, where it does end up looking a little bit more interesting and a little bit more natural. And I think that's pretty much all I've got to say for today. I've been waffling on a little bit, but I hope some of it has been interesting or useful to you. If there are any things that you would like me to talk about in future videos, leave me a comment and let me know what you would like to hear about. And if there are any requests for images that you'd like to see me colour, that sort of thing, if you leave me a comment, I will do my very best to get round to it at some point. You will find the link to my blog post to go with this video with all of the relevant information, links to products, etc., a full list of Copic markers used, down in the description box below. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time.